I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
It was a most extraordinary evening at Windermere House, the sprawling estate of Lord and Lady Radley, perched upon the windswept cliffs of Cornwall. A storm had rolled in from the sea with the dusk, lashing the windows with rain and rattling the French doors of the great drawing-room. Inside, the Radleys' guests, gathered for a weekend of convivial company and charity entertainments, were grateful for the warmth of the blazing fire and the endless supply of champagne. The gathering was one of society's more curious assortments. Wealthy patrons of the arts mingled with minor aristocrats, journalists, a celebrated actress, a retired colonel, and the local vicar's sister. The air was thick with conversation, rivalry, and the faint whiff of scandal, delicious, dangerous, and never too far from the surface. At precisely 9:30, Lady Radley suggested a change of amusement. Cards had been played, dinner consumed, and spirits were beginning to languish. A round of charades, she declared, would liven the company. Laughter followed, and guests paired off in high spirits. The storm, however, seemed to protest more violently, rumbling as though displeased at human mirth. It was not long after that the house was shaken by a sound entirely apart from thunder, a cry, sharp, ragged, unmistakably human. A footman, pale and stammering, appeared in the doorway. "My lady, it is Miss Daventry, in the East Gallery." The guests rushed in a frightened throng to the long, dimly lit corridor. There, in front of a shattered mirror, lay Miss Celia Daventry, the vicar's sister, lifeless upon the marble floor. The gilt-framed glass had splintered violently, its shards scattered like diamonds across the rug, and protruding from her hand was a torn scrap of paper. The note, spotted with blood, contained only a few hastily scribbled words. "He knows." The guests stared in silence, horror reflected in the broken shards all around them. Within the hour, the local constable had been summoned, questions asked, statements collected. Yet confusion reigned. Who was he? What did he know? And why had Celia Daventry been alone in the gallery when she had been so animated and talkative not half an hour before? It was Lady Radley herself who, her face pale but her composure intact, whispered the words that seemed to still the restless company. "We must send for Monsieur Poirot." And thus, with the rain pounding and the house still reverberating with shock, the stage was set for Hercule Poirot, Belgium's most celebrated detective, master of psychology, order, and the little grey cells, to unravel the most delicate and dangerous affair yet. The storm did not abate. It settled into the eaves and grumbled along the chimneys. Lady Radley, pale but composed, drew everyone back to the drawing-room. The constable, having viewed the East Gallery, stood hat in hand by the door and deferred to the hostess. "We shall keep to order," she said. "You will each say where you were after charades. It is not accusation, it is prudence." They obeyed with the awkwardness of people who had rehearsed elegance but not calamity. Lord Radley took the mantle. Reverend Daventry sat apart, fingers locked, his cuffs marked by brown threads of his sister's blood. Delphine Vale, the actress, balanced on the edge of a chaise. Colonel Armitage stood as though the carpet were parade ground. Greta Schuyler, the American heiress, chose a low chair near the hearth. Rupert Wayland, critic and opportunist, prowled. Julian Hart, journalist, lounged with affected ease. Alice Hart remained close to Lady Radley, as if her quietness might be useful. Delphine began. "I went upstairs for a wrap. Rose," the maid with anxious eyebrows, "saw me on the landing. I returned and found the room empty." "Time?" Wayland asked. 10 minutes, 12 at most." Julian spoke next. "Library. I made notes on the auction lots. The grandfather clock there struck 9:30. Alice said, "I stayed here. I tidied the cards and asked for coffee, then walked to the conservatory to latch 2 windows. I met no one." Colonel Armitage cleared his throat. Billiard room, a few strokes to settle the nerves. Greta said. I telephoned my maid from the morning room about a trunk. The line crackled dreadfully. I started along the gallery to admire the porcelain. Then the cry. Lord Radley's voice was precise. After charades, I went to my study to examine correspondence. I did not leave until the commotion. And I, said Lady Radley, remained with Mrs. Hart and the butler regarding coffee and rooms. I sent a footman for more logs. Eyes turned, almost ceremonially, to the vicar. He did not flinch. Celia left the drawing-room to stretch her legs. She dislikes noise when the weather presses. I followed some minutes later, meaning to coax her back. I met no one until I found her. He drew breath. She cannot have merely fallen, she wrote. He knows. That is not the hand of a woman surprised by accident. The mirror is high, Alice observed. One must strike it. Or throw, Wayland said. Books, for instance. Dear Rupert, Julian murmured, you mistake murder for metaphor. Gentlemen, said Lady Radley, and the word restored civility. The constable stepped forward. Lights were on in the sconces. There's blood on the marble and shards everywhere. No footprints, I'll swear to. The rugs took them, and folk rushing about spoilt the rest. The scrap was in the lady's right hand. We'll keep together tonight and not be sending telegrams. The inspector comes at first light. From where? Rupert asked. Penzance, said the constable. Silence followed. Greta carried brandy to the vicar. He did not drink. Delphine lit a cigarette and held it so the tremor became style. What did she mean? Delphine asked the E. Fire. Who knows? And what? Secrets, Julian said. At house parties we consume food, gossip, and secrets in equal measure. Lord Radley looked up. Miss Vale, you spoke to Miss Daventry at dinner. We all did, Delphine answered. She was delightful. I cannot imagine who would wish her harm. Delightful and forthright, Wayland said. She told me the vicarage roof leaks and that I ought to donate to the school fund rather than to a portrait of Lord Radley's forebear. Reverend Daventry lifted his head. My sister believed promises bind. Some pledged more than they gave. She may have reminded them. Greta flushed faintly. If she reminded me, I was grateful. Was she frightened? Alice asked. No, said the vicar. Resolved. The constable consulted a notebook. Doors to the gallery were unlatched, no sign of forced entry at the terrace. Rain would have told me if a man came that way. It did not. For practical purposes, the house is a closed circle. Then, he knows must point to one of us, Wayland said softly. Lady Radley rose again. You will retire now. The servants will show you. My husband and I will remain here with the constable. In the morning, Monsieur Poirot arrives. Poirot? Delphine echoed. The little man with the perfect tie. The man, Lady Radley replied. As they drifted toward the doors, the vicar turned back. If she wrote, he knows, she meant a man present tonight. Whatever the cost to pride or purse, speak when asked. My sister did not write for effect. She wrote to warn. The doors closed one by one, and the drawing-room shrank to its ordinary dimensions. On the mantel, ormolu clock ticked indifferently. Somewhere in the house the wind found a seam and sang at it. In the east gallery, a gilt mirror gaped like a wound, and a torn scrap of paper, crisping as it dried, waited for the only man in England who would read it not as melodrama, but as a sum to be solved. The morning came, washed in a thin, silvery light that made the sea look like beaten pewter, and the lawns like damp felt. With it came Hercule Poirot, precise as a timetable, stepping from the motor car as though the gravel had been arranged for his feet in particular. He inclined his head to Lady Radley, to the constable, to Lord Radley, and then to the day itself, which had the grace to be calmer than the night. His travelling coat was immaculate, his moustaches perfect, his eyes already busy. Without haste, without waste, he asked to see the east gallery before he spoke to anyone at all. The constable led the way. The gallery retained the faint mineral smell of rain and stone. The great mirror, veiled with a dust sheet during the night by the butler's prudence, still gave the impression of a wound bandaged in haste. Poirot lifted a corner of the sheet with 2 fingers. The gilt frame was gashed along one lower side where a blow had struck the glass. The remaining shards were a mosaic of patient cruelties. He crouched, examined the scatter upon the rug and the cold gleam upon the marble. "Ah," he said softly, "but this is not a rage that explodes. It is a choice that lands exactly." He indicated with a forefinger a neat crescent of tiny fragments, then a bare patch. "Observe, mes amis, how the fine powder lies here, but not here. A heel carried some away, but not a heavy heel. The pressure is delicate, light, one who walks with intention to leave no trace." The constable shifted. "We came quickly last night." "Yes, and spoiled what could be spoiled," Poirot agreed amiably. "Yet the little order remains for him who respects it. The note, s'il vous plaît." The scrap lay in a folded envelope. Poirot did not touch it. He looked. "Right hand," he murmured. The torn edges clean on 2 sides and ragged on the 3rd. Not from a diary with perforation. From a letter, perhaps. Ink not blotted by haste, but by the wetness that is the blood. And the words, "He knows." Not "I know." To whom did she bequeath this drama? To us, certainly, but primarily to the one who would read and be afraid. He straightened, glanced at the sconces. "Electric light, yes? The bulbs are modern." "New last month," Lord Radley said from the doorway, his voice controlled. "The switch, then." Poirot brushed a lacework smear on the brass plate. Someone with damp fingers, or someone who came in from the conservatory. "The window there." The constable showed the latch. The rain beads were dried to faint tracks. Poirot measured the sill with his gaze, then shook his head. "No mud, no sea air stain. The visitor last night did not come by the garden, so it is the house. It is the little society one makes for a weekend, with its smiles and its private accounts to settle." He asked, very quietly, for the positions of the guests at 9:30, and Lady Radley repeated the recital of movements. He listened without interruption, once raising a hand when Greta spoke of the telephone. "Crackled dreadfully?" he said. "Bon. In the morning room?" "Yes," Greta replied. "I rang twice. It is an old line." "Old lines, old lies," murmured Poirot, and offered her a small apology of a smile. He asked next for Miss Daventry's room. The vicar, face ashen but set, accompanied them. The room was spare and neat, with a travel Bible, a coil of blue ribbon upon the dressing table, and a small bunch of late roses in a tumbler. Poirot's eyes rested upon the ribbon. He lifted it, looked at the end, and replaced it with tenderness. In the grate, a scrap of grey ash still held the ghost of handwriting. He bent close but did not touch. Instead, he sent for the ash shovel and carried the little relic as if it were a bird that might startle. "She burned something," he said. "A page, perhaps, not entirely. If we are fortunate, the edges will speak." Downstairs, in the breakfast room, the company assembled with the careful nonchalance of people who have slept beside a scandal. Cups rattled, spooned eggs cooled untouched. Delphine Vale's pallor was picturesque. Colonel Armitage's newspaper trembled once and composed itself. Rupert Wayland watched everyone with the pleased malice of a man who believes himself immune to consequences. Julian Hart pretended to be bored and failed. Alice Hart's attention strayed always to the vicar. Greta, bright and grave, sat neatly and tried not to look at the door. Poirot took a single roll, buttered it with mathematical exactitude, and made his little bow. "Mesdames, messieurs, I am distressed to come into your hospitality thus. I beg your patience. Last night a lady died, and she wrote 2 words. They are not theatrical. They are strategic. They are the message of one who perceived a danger already present. To understand for whom they are written, I must first understand you. He did not interrogate. He conversed. He asked Delphine whether the wrap was velvet or silk, and whether it snagged on anything upon the landing. He inquired of Greta if the telephone crackled before or after she dialed, and whether she was answered at once. He asked Colonel Armitage whether he chalked the cue. He asked Alice which windows she latched, and why. He asked Julian what auction lots interested him, and whether the grandfather clock gained or lost. "Gains 5 minutes in 2 days," Julian said, caught unawares. Poirot nodded as if the universe had confirmed a private theorem. He turned to Lord Radley. "In your study there are letters. One of them, perhaps, missing a piece." Lord Radley's hand closed upon the back of a chair. "If you mean to search, I mean to ask," said Poirot gently. "For if a letter has been excerpted, it may explain why a lady wrote in blood rather than in ink." Lady Radley's eyes flickered to the vicar and back. "We will look." "Merci, milady. And you, monsieur le vicaire, there is one thing only. Your sister, she was resolved. Resolved on what?" "To compel someone to speak truth," he said. "She did not tell me whose." Poirot inclined his head. "Then we must invite truth to breakfast." He took the ash from Miss Daventry's grate and the envelope with the note and, with a courteous apology, asked the butler for a bright tray and a sheet of black card. He spread the grey ash thinly, teased from it a darker curl in which a half-letter survived. Perhaps the elegant tail of a Y. Perhaps not. He frowned, then smiled. "It is enough," he said softly. "One sees where the fire bites first." No one understood him, which appeared to please him more. He set down the tray, looked tenderly at the assembled faces, and made his request as if inviting them to a picnic rather than to an ordeal. "Now," said Hercule Poirot, "you will permit me a very small inspection of your shoes." They obliged, some with good humor and some with a faint air of people compelled to show their bank balances. The butler produced a long linen napkin, which Poirot spread upon a side table as delicately as if he were laying out jewels. One by one the shoes came. Delphine's satin evening slippers, scuffed at the toe. Greta's low-heeled pumps, meticulously brushed. Colonel Armitage's sturdy Oxfords, the welt chalk-dusted. Julian's brown brogues, clever and a trifle flamboyant. Alice's neat tea-straps, polished to propriety. Rupert's gleaming patents, the vicar's plain boots, Lord Radley's fastidious black calf, Lady Radley's soft kid. Poirot peered, not pounced. He touched a sole with a paper knife, lifted a heel, considered a welt as if it had whispered. Now and then he breathed a soft, contented "tiens," which meant nothing and everything. "You observed powder on the carpet upstairs," Rupert said lightly. "Do our shoes serve as sieves?" "Sometimes," Poirot answered, "and sometimes they tell a story entirely different." He held up Delphine's slipper. "Here, see, a tiny snag at the inner edge. A brad in the stair carpet could do this, but so could velvet. You went for a wrap. Velvet kisses satin and leaves the little teeth." Delphine smiled faintly. "I accept the rebuke." I hurried. The corridor was a draught. Greta's pumps bore a faint tide mark about the heel. "From the telephone room," she said quickly. The mat was damp. "The morning room," Poirot murmured. "Just so." He inspected Colonel Armitage's soles next. A dusting like pale ash lay in the tread channels. He teased a few grains onto a sheet of black card. Against the dark, the flecks showed a glint that was not ash, but mica. "Billiard chalk," the colonel said with relief. "The table wants brushing." "Eh bien," said Poirot, non-committal. Julian's brogues gave him pause. A faint crescent of clean across the forepart of the left sole, as though a thin wire had scraped it. He traced it with the paper knife, nodded to himself, and set them aside. Alice's tea-straps were immaculate. Rupert's patent leather, for all their mirror bravado, had a nick at the outer heel cutting across older polish. Poirot looked at it closely and only said, "You walk fast when you're bored." "I am rarely anything else," Rupert replied, amused. The vicar's boots carried no novelty but grief. Lord Radley's were faultless. Lady Radley's kid showed a small dot of pale wax upon the instep. Poirot sniffed, smiled, and said nothing at all. When the shoes had returned to their owners, Poirot folded the napkin with the same care he had unfolded it. He asked so lightly the request felt like a compliment, to see the billiard room. Colonel Armitage led them, pleased to be useful. The green baize wore the faint constellation of last night's play. Poirot bent over the cradle of cues, noted a hairline scratch on one, ran a thumb along chalked tips, and drifted to the window. Its latch bore a smear of old grease. Close by, scarcely noticed against the carpet's pattern, lay a small gold cuff-link. "Not mine," the colonel said quickly, then checked himself. "That is, of course, men have cuff-links. I wore my regimental." "Regimental have the little crown, yes," Poirot said, turning the find in the light. "This has the letter W entwined. Monsieur Wayland, perhaps." Rupert, summoned, turned his head with elegant boredom. "Possibly. I possess dozens of initialed trifles that fling themselves from me at parties." He accepted the cuff-link, pocketed it, and looked injured by the triviality. "If you suppose I brawled beside a billiard table, I must disappoint you. I brawl only with prose." "I suppose nothing," said Poirot gently. "I observe. We return to the gallery, if you please." The gallery smelled of sleep removed and day admitted. Poirot stood where the broken mirror made a cold geometry of the morning. He looked along the line of sconces, at the console beneath the glass, at a porcelain shepherdess whose nose had been cleverly mended long ago. He put his fingertip to the note's envelope again, not touching the paper itself, and then to the console's mahogany. There was a faint smear there, as if a finger wet with ink, or blood, had searched for purchase. "The lady fell from this height to the marble," he said softly. "But first she reached, or was made to reach, toward the console. She writes 2 words. She tears from a letter. Whence the letter?" Lady Radley had the grace to lead him to the study at once. The desk was arranged like a chessboard before the opening move. Inkstand centered, letters stacked, a paper knife aligned exactly. Poirot, each gesture a permission asked, examined the pile. One envelope had its flap intact, and a square missing from the lower edge of the folded sheet within, neatly torn, leaving a ragged 3rd side, brother to the scrap downstairs. Lord Radley's lips compressed. "It is a solicitation," he said stiffly. "A gentleman's club in Mayfair. I had not decided." "The missing corner?" Poirot inquired. "I noticed nothing." "Yet someone noticed very much," Poirot said, and replaced the letter precisely. "Who would tear from a solicitation the corner that bears the motto? Not the thief of money, no, the thief of convenience." The constable looked lost. "Meaning, sir?" "Meaning that a glossy scrap takes ink poorly," Poirot said, eyes on the window where the sea lay like pewter hammered thin. "Miss Daventry chose, or accepted, a poor paper because time was the enemy. And yet the words are not panic, they are the chess. He knows. We must learn not who knows, but what may be known." He asked then, very politely, to see the morning-room telephone. The instrument squatted upon a narrow table, its mouthpiece like a black trumpet. Poirot lifted the receiver, replaced it, lifted again. The cord was frayed near the base and bound with an improvised thread. He glanced at Greta. "You rang twice?" "Yes," she said. "No one answered the first time." "And the crackle, before you dialed or after?" "Before," she said. "It was like weather in the wire." "Weather does not tie knots," Poirot murmured, stooping. The frayed place bore a minute twist of blue fibre, thread akin to that coil upon Miss Daventry's dressing table. He did not touch it. He looked as if at a friend who had decided to speak. He straightened and turned, his tone airy and precise. "We advance, a very little," he said. "Now, if you will be so amiable, we shall invite Truth to take the air in the conservatory." The conservatory was a long chamber of glass and iron, filled with the smell of damp earth and the sharp sweetness of orchids. Overnight rain had smeared the panes, and the morning light came filtered, making the foliage gleam like lacquered bronze. Poirot entered with the poise of a man stepping into a salon, not a hothouse. He paused to straighten a pot that leaned, then moved to the center, turning slowly, eyes traveling from the tiled floor to the high roof. The party followed, subdued, as if compelled to trail a schoolmaster through a gallery of specimens. "It is here, mes amis," he said gently. "That one window was reported unlatched. A trifle, yes? Yet trifles are the threads with which truth embroiders itself." He pointed to the long windows at the eastern end. The constable tugged at the latch, which moved with a metallic creak. On the inner sill lay a tiny grain of glass, out of place among the leaf mould. Poirot tapped it with his nail and let it fall onto a white card. "The mirror weeps into the conservatory," he murmured. Greta leaned forward. "But surely that is only a fragment carried on someone's shoe." "Non, mademoiselle. The glass has travelled by the air, not the foot. One finds it upon the sill, not the tile. Thus, when the mirror shattered, the conservatory door stood open. Why? To permit air, to admit egress. We shall see." Rupert gave a dry laugh. "So now the orchids are accomplices. What next? Shall the goldfish testify?" "Perhaps," Poirot said serenely. "For example, if one observes the water." He bent above a glass tank where fronds of weed swayed and golden bodies moved. The surface was disturbed recently. A leaf rests not as it falls, but as it is placed. He touched the rim of the tank, then regarded Rupert with a kind of mild pity. "You mock, mon ami, but the world is precise. Even the smallest thing may speak." The colonel shifted uneasily. "Do you mean someone slipped in here after she was found?" Poirot raised a hand. "Not after. During. Someone who calculated that commotion in the gallery would draw every ear away. What better moment to conceal, to drop, to destroy?" He looked again at the tiles. In a corner, half hidden under a fern pot, lay a matchstick, blackened halfway, bent like a broken finger. He lifted it with tweezers the butler supplied. A match struck, yet not used. Why? Because it flared at the wrong instant. It revealed a face to itself. Julian's smooth voice broke the hush. "But if someone came here to hide, why not remain until the crowd dispersed? Why risk leaving signs?" "Because, monsieur, one cannot vanish indefinitely from a closed house. The absence is noted as keenly as the presence. Therefore, our visitor counted seconds, not hours, and in haste one leaves behind the little companions. Glass grains, struck matches, fibers of thread." Poirot turned the matchstick over, then handed it to the constable. "Keep it safe. It may yet whisper." Alice spoke for the first time in many minutes, her tone quiet. "You said earlier that Miss Daventry was resolved. Do you think she came to the conservatory herself?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, mademoiselle. She was in the gallery when the end came, but she prepared. She destroyed one thing and she attempted to leave another. She wrote with blood when she could no longer write with ink. That is the mark of resolution." The vicar's hands trembled on the back of a wicker chair. "My sister was no spy. She sought only truth." "Truth, monsieur le vicaire, is the most dangerous thing in the world," Poirot replied. "It burns like fire and blinds like light. For some, it is death to be looked at by truth." Lady Radley's voice cut gently into the silence. "Monsieur Poirot, what are we to do? The inspector from Penzance comes at noon." My guests are restless, and the servants—" Poirot inclined his head. "You will keep them calm. There is no need for panic. I will speak privately with each of you, and perhaps I shall make small requests. It is in the tiny observations, you see, that order emerges." He paused, adjusting his cuffs. Already one small order becomes visible. There are two who attempt too hard to appear indifferent. Indifference, mes amis, is a mask, and masks do not fit perfectly. Rupert's smile sharpened. "You mean me, of course, and perhaps our gallant colonel." Poirot gave a little bow, neither denying nor confirming. "I mean what I mean. You will forgive that I do not yet declare it. To announce too soon is to permit the fox to slip his snare." The constable cleared his throat. "Shall I set a watch on the gallery, sir?" "Oui, and another on the telephone room, but discreetly. A bird frightened from cover will not return." Poirot's eyes wandered once more across the orchids, the tank, the tall glass panes. He seemed almost to sigh. "It is enough for now. Let us leave these green witnesses to their peace." They filed out, their footsteps echoing on the tiled floor, each lost in private reckonings. Poirot lingered a moment longer, one hand resting on the doorframe, his gaze distant. When he turned to join them, the faintest smile hovered under his mustache, as though he had seen the shape of the trap he meant to set, though the prey still lay hidden. In the corridor, the storm had left a hush that felt fragile, like porcelain set too close to the edge of a shelf. Guests murmured excuses for rest, for letters to be written, for walks in the tamed parkland. Poirot allowed them, but his eyes followed each departure with the quiet certainty of a man who knows every move on the board will return to the center. As he mounted the stairs toward his chamber, he thought of the fragment of ash in the grate, the torn corner of the letter, the frayed telephone cord, the solitary words in blood. Together they formed not a picture, but an outline, waiting to be filled with color. And in the conservatory, unseen, a single orchid petal loosened and fell soundlessly to the damp tile, like a secret surrendering itself at last. Poirot allowed himself only the briefest interlude in his room. He unpacked nothing, set his valise precisely by the wall, and smoothed the coverlet as if to impose order upon the disorder of murder. Then, descending once more, he requested that Lady Radley grant him the small morning parlour for his interviews. It was a delicate chamber, with pale wallpaper patterned with faded sprigs, and it possessed a window seat that looked toward the restless sea. Poirot placed a chair at exact right angles to the window and sat with his back to the light, so that the faces opposite him would be illuminated in their every flicker. The first to enter was Delphine Vale, as though compelled by her own sense of theatre. She wore a shawl of sheer black chiffon and carried herself like a woman prepared for any scrutiny. She sat gracefully, crossed her legs, and met Poirot's gaze with a studied calm. "You are accustomed, mademoiselle, to audiences," Poirot said with a small bow. "And yet last night was not a stage, but a tragedy most real. You went upstairs for your wrap. Tell me again, did you see anyone in the gallery as you returned?" "No one," she replied, her voice smooth. "The corridor was empty except for the draught I mentioned. I'm not accustomed to draughts, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's mustache twitched. "You're not accustomed to lies either, I think. At least not your own. You do not invent, but you omit. There was someone you chose not to name. A shadow, perhaps. A figure in haste?" Delphine's poise faltered for an instant. She recovered with a laugh. "A shadow, perhaps. One always imagines them in corridors. If I saw a figure, I cannot swear to whom. Shall I risk condemning an innocent?" "No, monsieur. That is not my role." Poirot inclined his head, releasing her with courtesy, but he noted the tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her shawl. Next came Colonel Armitage. His military bearing was intact, though his eyes darted to the window as if gauging escape. Poirot asked him of his time in the billiard room. "I played a few strokes, chalked the cue, and then returned. Armitage said stoutly. And yet the ash upon your shoes was not chalk, mon colonel, but mica of the sort one finds in the decorative pots of the conservatory tiles, Poirot replied softly. You went there, did you not? The colonel stiffened. Briefly. I thought to smoke in peace. The gallery was crowded, but when I lit the match I heard the cry. I dropped it and went. That is all. Why not say so before? Poirot asked. Because it seemed unimportant, and because one's movements, when tragedy occurs, are always made to appear sinister by others. I am not accustomed to justifying myself to gossip. Poirot dismissed him with a grave nod, yet his little grey cells turned over the fact that the colonel had omitted the conservatory, until pressed. Julian Hart followed. He was all languor and charm, but his eyes were too bright. Poirot inquired about the clock in the library, and Julian repeated his earlier remark. Poirot pressed further. You write for the papers, monsieur. You observe detail. When you left the library, was the gallery light bright or dim? Julian frowned, then smiled ruefully. Dim, I think. One bulb had gone out. I remember cursing under my breath. But you will ask why I recall such a trifle. Because I am trained to notice trifles. I have no reason to conceal them. Poirot said nothing more, but stored the observation like a pin in a map. Alice Hart came next, modest and pale. She sat neatly, hands folded. Poirot regarded her with unusual gentleness. You secured the windows in the conservatory, mademoiselle. You are thoughtful. Did you secure also the truth? Alice flushed. I only wished to keep the house warm. I did see someone pass the conservatory as I stood by the latch, but I thought little of it. And this someone, was it man or woman? Woman, Alice whispered. She moved quickly. I thought she carried something folded, perhaps a letter. Poirot let silence fall, long enough for Alice's nerves to betray her sincerity. He thanked her, and she withdrew with relief. Rupert Wayland entered with a sardonic smile. He dropped into the chair as if it were a stage throne. You have my cufflink, I trust. I seem always to scatter them. Poirot met his gaze evenly. It is true, monsieur, you scatter many things, your wit, your opinions, your disdain. But cufflinks do not fall far from their owner. Tell me, why were you in the billiard room? To escape the actress's monologues, Rupert replied. I bent to retrieve a chalk, perhaps, and lost the trinket. It proves nothing except that billiards bores me. Perhaps, Poirot said softly. But perhaps you bent to retrieve more than chalk. A letter corner, for instance? Rupert's eyes narrowed, then he laughed. Monsieur Poirot, you weave nets from cobwebs, but who knows? Perhaps I enjoy being suspected. It gives life flavor. He left with the careless step of one who hides his tension behind bravado. Greta Schuyler appeared, earnest and polished. Poirot asked her once more of the telephone. She repeated her tale, but faltered when he mentioned the blue thread wound about the fray. I cannot explain that, she admitted, unless Miss Daventry herself repaired it earlier. She was practical in such matters. Practical, yes, Poirot mused. And yet she burned a page in her grate, an act not of practicality but of fear. The vicar entered last, sombre, his grief heavy. Poirot asked him nothing at first, only waited. At length the man spoke. She confronted someone, Monsieur Poirot. Of that I am sure. She believed sin must be named aloud. She may have forced a hand. Then it is the hand we must find, Poirot said gently. When the interviews ended, Poirot remained alone in the parlour. He reviewed the notes of his little cells. Delphine's omission, Armitage's half-truth, Julian's observation of a dim light, Alice's glimpse of a woman, Rupert's cufflink, Greta's thread, the vicar's conviction. Each detail was a bead, separate, meaningless, alone. Yet together they promised a pattern. He closed his eyes a moment, letting the storm of impressions settle into order. At last he opened them, and they were bright with certainty. "It is as always," he murmured. "The truth sits quietly among us, waiting for its name. And soon, very soon, it shall be named." Poirot did not rest after the interviews. He stepped out into the corridor, where the house's hush seemed weighted with withheld words. The sea crashed faintly below the cliffs, and the smell of damp wood lingered in the air. He asked the butler for a tray of tea to be sent to the drawing-room, then walked there himself, hands clasped behind his back, eyes glancing over every painting, rug, and candlestick as though they too might betray a confidence. When the tray arrived, he poured a cup with meticulous precision, stirred exactly 3 times, and sipped while he waited. It was not long before Lady Radley entered, her composure steady, but her gaze restless. "You have unsettled them all, Monsieur Poirot," she said, settling into a chair near the fire. "They whisper in corners and eye one another like adversaries on the eve of battle." Poirot nodded gravely. "That is well, madame. Truth does not emerge when one is too comfortable. It comes when pride is stung, when nerves fray, when masks slip." She studied him with quiet intensity. "You already suspect who it was." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Suspect, yes. But suspicion is not proof. My little cells have arranged themselves into an image that pleases, yet one must be cautious. A single bead wrongly strung can spoil the whole necklace. I wait for one more piece." Their conversation was interrupted by Rupert Wayland, who entered without ceremony, his voice sharp. "So, Poirot, is this the grand performance, whispering with Lady Radley while the rest of us stew in suspicion? If you mean to accuse, accuse. Otherwise, let us eat luncheon in peace." Poirot regarded him without irritation. "Monsieur, you are impatient, but the truth does not leap like a tiger. It arrives like a gentleman, properly announced." Rupert gave a mocking bow. "Then we must hope your gentleman does not lose his way." He left with a flare of his coat. Lady Radley sighed. "He delights in provocation, yet even he looked pale this morning." "Because, madame," Poirot said softly, "he knows he plays upon dangerous ground." Soon after, Greta appeared at the door, hesitant. She carried a folded sheet of paper, her hand trembling slightly. She offered it to Poirot with a glance toward Lady Radley. "I found this, tucked into the pages of a novel in the library. It is in Miss Daventry's hand, I believe." Poirot unfolded the sheet with care. The writing was neat, certain. It read, "If he will not confess, then I must write it down. The mirror is my witness. Tonight I will make him face it." Lady Radley's hand flew to her mouth. "The mirror! She wrote of it before it broke." Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, voilà. The lady chose the mirror as a stage, a place of revelation. She meant to confront the guilty there, to force his acknowledgement. Instead, she died upon its marble floor. Yet in this note lies both her purpose and the danger. He folded it carefully. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have brought the key that turns the lock." Greta hesitated. "Do you believe she meant Rupert?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I believe she meant a man. Which one? That is what remains to be proved." When Greta departed, Poirot remained by the fire, deep in thought. The inspector from Penzance was due within the hour, but Poirot desired the truth before bureaucracy muddied it with procedure. He rang for the butler and instructed that all guests be gathered once more in the drawing-room after luncheon. By 2 o'clock, the company assembled. The air was thick with unease. Rupert lounged with affected nonchalance. Delphine smoked furiously, Julian polished his glasses, though they bore no smudge, and the colonel stood as stiff as if on parade. Alice sat near the vicar, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Greta remained by the mantel, her eyes lowered. Poirot rose, his voice calm yet carrying authority. "Mesdames, messieurs, forgive me this intrusion upon your peace, but the death of Miss Daventry demands clarity. I have listened, I have observed. I have asked the questions. Now I begin to see the order beneath the confusion." He let the silence build before continuing. "Consider. Miss Daventry burned a page in her grate. Why? Because it named a truth she feared to reveal too soon. Yet she also tore a corner from a letter and carried it that she might write in extremity. She wrote indeed with her blood. He knows. Who knows? Not she, but he, the man she confronted. The words were not accusation, but warning. He knows that she knows. That is a subtlety one must admire." He began to pace slowly, his gaze touching each face. "One of you feared discovery so keenly that violence became inevitable. Miss Daventry chose the gallery, the mirror, to stage her confrontation, and so the mirror shattered. But she, even dying, left us enough to follow." Colonel Armitage shifted. "And who is it, Poirot? Enough of riddles." Poirot stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Patience, mon colonel. Each of you carries suspicion. Mademoiselle Delphine saw a shadow, but withheld it. The colonel himself concealed a visit to the conservatory. Monsieur Julien noted the dim light, which reveals he was indeed near the gallery. Mademoiselle Alice glimpsed a woman with a folded letter. Monsieur Wayland left a cufflink near the billiard table. And Mademoiselle Greta found a note, but only today, though it must have been written before last night. Each has secrets." He let the words settle like dust, then added with quiet force, "But only one of you stood before the mirror when it shattered." The room held its breath. Rupert gave a strained laugh, but no one echoed it. Poirot looked from face to face, his gaze unhurried, as though weighing them not by guilt alone, but by the measure of their hearts. Then he turned back to the fire, clasped his hands behind him, and said softly, "One more step, and the truth will reveal itself with the elegance of a solved equation. Until then, I ask you, mes amis, remain together. The house is closed, the storm has passed, and soon, very soon, there will be no more shadows." The silence was profound. Even Rupert did not speak, and in that hush, Poirot's words hung like the faint chime of a bell, a promise that the mask would soon fall. The inspector from Penzance arrived as the clock struck 3, bringing with him the smell of wet wool and the blunt air of officialdom. He was a solid man with weathered features, used to farm disputes and tavern brawls more than drawing-room murders. He surveyed the company gathered in the great room with the heavy gaze of one who expects lies but lacks patience for riddles. Poirot, ever courteous, bowed and greeted him, then explained with calm precision that certain threads of the affair were already drawn together, though the knot remained to be tied. The inspector listened, frowning, but allowed Poirot to continue, perhaps relieved to share the burden with the little Belgian whose reputation had preceded him. Poirot asked the company to remain as before, then suggested they each partake of tea and small sandwiches the butler had prepared. It was a strange tableau. Death hung over the house, yet cups clinked and plates rattled as though etiquette demanded that life proceed with its trivial courtesies. Poirot stood by the mantelpiece, his back straight, his moustache immaculate. He watched them as they sipped, his gaze traveling slowly from one to the next. He spoke softly, yet the words carried. "It is curious, is it not, that a house filled with refinement should so quickly resemble a theater of masks? Each of you hides something. Some secrets are harmless, some selfish, and one, mes amis, is fatal." Delphine flicked ash into a tray with a practiced elegance. "If you mean me, monsieur, I confess to nothing more sinister than vanity. I omitted a shadow because it was insubstantial." "Ah, but the insubstantial often weighs heavily," Poirot replied. "Mademoiselle Alice saw a woman passing with a folded letter. You saw a shadow. Perhaps they are the same, perhaps not. But between the two, there lies substance." Alice looked down, her cheeks pale. "I cannot swear. It was quick and I was nervous." "Nevertheless," Poirot said, "it tells us the gallery was not empty as claimed." The colonel cleared his throat. All this theorizing, Poirot. Better to ask who had the strength to strike her down. Miss Daventry was no frail creature. It took force. Poirot turned his gaze upon him. You are wrong, mon colonel. It took no force, only precision. A shove timed when she leaned, a grip upon her wrist when she reached for the console. The broken mirror was theatre, not accident. The fatal act required calculation, not strength. Rupert laughed suddenly. Too loud. Then accuse the actress. She knows all about theatre. Or our journalist friend who writes dramas on paper. Julian polished his glasses again, a nervous tic disguised as composure. And what of you, Wayland? Your cufflink lies in the billiard room like a calling card. Rupert's smile stiffened. Perhaps I left it there to amuse Poirot. Poirot raised a hand, silencing the ripple of accusation. Enough. We return always to the note. He knows. Ask yourselves, why not write a name? Why only those 2 words? Because she feared that if she wrote too much, her killer would snatch it away before it could be seen. She wrote what she could, just enough to tell us the danger lay in knowledge, not in ignorance. Greta spoke then, her voice trembling. But knowledge of what? Poirot's eyes softened. Of deceit, mademoiselle. A deception woven not yesterday, but weeks ago. Miss Daventry had stumbled upon it, perhaps by chance, perhaps by persistence. She was a woman of conscience. She would not allow it to rest. And so she confronted the guilty one here, before the mirror, intending to force confession. Instead, she paid with her life. The inspector stirred. If you've the name, Monsieur Poirot, best give it plain. I've no patience for riddles. Poirot inclined his head. Patience, Inspector. We are not at the final act. The pattern is visible but incomplete. I require one more moment of truth. He turned to the assembly. This afternoon you will all remain together. No one leaves the house. I will speak once more with the vicar in private, and then, mes amis, the curtain will rise. The inspector grunted his assent, though impatience showed in the set of his jaw. The guests dispersed to corners of the room, each cloaked in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Poirot beckoned Reverend Daventry to follow him into the smaller parlour. There, in the subdued light, Poirot spoke gently. Monsieur le Vicaire, you loved your sister. Tell me, to whom did she speak in the days before this gathering? Did she hint at her suspicions? The vicar's eyes were shadowed. She spoke of honor. She said lies had taken root where honor should be. She named no one, only that she would not permit hypocrisy to stand unchallenged. His hands trembled as he folded them. She believed she had God's work to do. Poirot nodded gravely. Then she chose the mirror as her pulpit to expose falsehood, and the sinner silenced her. The vicar's voice broke. I failed her. I should have pressed her to tell me more. Non, Poirot said softly. She was resolute. Nothing would have swayed her. But take comfort. Her words still speak. He knows. They lead us still. Leaving the vicar with bowed head, Poirot returned to the drawing-room. He looked once more at the company, who now avoided each other's eyes, each sunk in private fear. He stood by the hearth, warming his hands briefly, then addressed them. Mesdames, Messieurs, I thank you for your patience. The moment approaches when the shadows will lift. You see, the truth is not hidden in complexity, but in simplicity. Who among you feared exposure? Who among you carried something to the conservatory, struck a match, and then abandoned it in haste? Who tore a corner from a letter to provide paper for a dying hand? Who knew that Miss Daventry intended confrontation and so arranged to silence her before confession could be spoken aloud? These are the questions whose answers now align. The inspector shifted. And you've aligned them? Poirot's smile was small but certain. Almost, mon ami. By tonight there will be no doubt. The guilty one cannot help himself. He must betray his own fear, and I, Hercule Poirot, will be here to see it. The room was utterly still. The sea roared faintly outside, and the great clock on the mantel ticked toward the hour. Suspense, heavy and electric, filled the air. Each guest knew that time was running out, and soon one of them would be unmasked. The afternoon darkened as the sky gathered new clouds, though the storm had already passed. Inside Windermere House, the atmosphere grew heavier with every tick of the mantel clock, as though time itself pressed upon those gathered. They lingered in uneasy groups, their conversations strained and fragmentary, while Poirot moved quietly among them, watching with the patience of a chess master nearing the final move. The inspector, restless, paced before the fire, his boots creaking against the polished floor, and muttered that he preferred a plain confession to all this mystery. Poirot only inclined his head, as though indulgent of a child's complaint. It was Alice Hart who broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to Lady Radley. "I cannot bear this, waiting while we are all suspected. It is monstrous." Her hands clutched her handkerchief tightly, and her eyes flicked toward Rupert before lowering again. Rupert smirked. "The lady protests too much. Suspicion has its uses, Alice. It forces honesty, even if one must wring it from trembling lips." Colonel Armitage's voice cut sharp. "Enough of that, Wayland. You thrive on others' discomfort. This is no parlor game." Julian polished his glasses for the 10th time and said with forced nonchalance, "If Poirot means to unmask the killer, he had better do so before dinner. Otherwise, we shall all starve from suspense rather than guilt." Delphine exhaled smoke in a long, deliberate plume. "Speak for yourself, Julian. Suspense is my trade, but even I find this particular play a little too authentic." Poirot chose that moment to speak, his tone quiet but carrying. "Mes amis, there is a saying. One may conceal the truth from the eyes, but not from the nerves. Already the guilty heart beats irregularly. Already the guilty hand trembles when it believes itself unseen." He turned his gaze deliberately toward the conservatory doors, which stood closed at the far end of the room. "And it is there, I think, that we shall find the final clue." The company followed reluctantly as Poirot led the way. The conservatory air was cooler now, tinged with damp and the fragrance of orchids. The inspector muttered about wild goose chases, but Poirot held up a hand for silence. He approached the tank of goldfish once more and regarded the water with that same curious tenderness he reserved for inanimate witnesses. With a swift gesture, he reached in and drew out a crumpled scrap of paper, waterlogged but still legible. He spread it carefully on a tray the butler provided. The words, in Celia Daventry's hand, blurred but clear enough, read, "He will destroy the cord. Do not let him." A gasp rippled through the group. Greta clutched the back of a chair for support. Alice paled further. Rupert gave a short laugh, quickly stifled. Poirot's eyes shone. Voila. The lady prepared more than one safeguard. She feared her message might be lost, and so she wrote again, concealing it where only patience would reveal it. The telephone cord, mes amis. That was her battleground. She discovered it tampered with. The blue thread tells us she sought to repair it, to preserve the proof. She knew the guilty one meant to silence communication. She wrote, and she hid the note. And now it comes back to us, though she cannot. The inspector bent over the tray. "Then whoever frayed that wire, he's our man." Poirot spread his hands. "Precisely. The tampered cord, the torn letter, the broken mirror, each an attempt to obscure, to delay, to mislead. But truth, like water, seeps through." Julian spoke suddenly, his voice sharp. "But anyone could have touched the telephone. Servants, guests." "Non, monsieur," Poirot interrupted gently. "It is not anyone. It is one. Only one had both motive and necessity. Only one feared the voice that might travel along that cord, and only one confronted Miss Daventry when she threatened to expose him at the mirror. She wrote, 'He knows, not for herself, but for us.' He knows she has uncovered the deception, and so he struck. Silence followed, so heavy it seemed to press upon the lungs. The goldfish swam lazily in their tank, oblivious. Outside, a gull cried once against the brooding sky. Poirot folded the damp note and placed it with the other in his pocket. "Tonight," he said softly, "I shall assemble you once more, as Miss Daventry intended, in the gallery before the mirror. There we shall let her witness speak, and there the guilty one shall be revealed." The inspector's brows knitted. "Why wait till tonight? You've evidence enough." Poirot shook his head. "Evidence, perhaps, but order, not yet. The guilty one is clever, accustomed to disguises. If I accuse now, doubt will linger. But in the gallery, where she wrote and where she died, the arrangement will be complete. Then the guilty will have no refuge." Lady Radley whispered, "It is dangerous, Poirot, to gather us all again in that place." "Danger, madame, is already among us," Poirot replied. "But only by recreating the stage can we draw down the final curtain." The company dispersed slowly, each with thoughts they dared not share. Alice lingered by the doorway, as though wishing to speak, but turned away at Rupert's mocking glance. The colonel marched off stiffly, muttering under his breath. Delphine dropped her cigarette into a vase and followed without a word. Julian lingered longest, his eyes narrowed as though calculating what Poirot had not yet said. Greta trailed behind, her hand brushing the banister for support. When at last the room was empty, save for Poirot and the inspector, the latter said bluntly, "You know who it is." Poirot's smile was faint but certain. "Yes, mon ami, I know, but knowing is not enough. One must show, and show in such a way that none can doubt. For the truth must not only be revealed, it must be accepted." He straightened his cuffs, glanced once more at the mirror of water in the tank, and murmured almost to himself, "By tonight, the little grey cells will have their symmetry, and then the murderer shall look upon his own reflection and tremble." The house seemed to breathe uneasily as twilight fell, its long corridors dim with the fading light of the storm-laden sky. Candles were lit in sconces, though their glow only deepened the shadows. The guests, restless and subdued, gathered in the great hall when Poirot requested it. Each came with their own air of dread. Delphine wrapped tight in her shawl, Greta pale as porcelain, Alice nervous and silent, Rupert with forced bravado, Julian tense behind his polished glasses, the colonel stiff with indignation, and the vicar hollow-eyed with grief. Lady Radley stood close to her husband, though her gaze never left Poirot. The inspector positioned himself like a watchman by the door, impatient but willing to concede the stage to the Belgian detective. Poirot led them toward the east gallery. The broken mirror loomed ahead, covered still by its dust sheet, a silent monument to violence. Poirot stopped before it, his figure small yet commanding. He turned slowly, his voice soft yet carrying through the long chamber. "Mesdames, messieurs, it is here that all began, and here that all shall end. Miss Daventry chose this place not by chance, but because it was her theatre of truth. She meant to confront a liar, to force him to confess, to use the mirror as her witness. Instead, she was silenced. Yet even in death, she contrived to leave us her message." He gestured to the envelope containing the blood-written words. "He knows." What did she mean? Not that she herself knew, but that he, the guilty man, knew she had discovered him. In those words, she left us her accusation. Later, in the conservatory, we found her second note. "He will destroy the cord. Do not let him." This points us to the tampered telephone, the frayed wire bound with her blue thread. She discovered it, and she attempted to preserve it. She knew communication was being silenced, lest truth escape the house. Poirot moved closer to the mirror and lifted the dust sheet away with a flourish. The shattered glass gleamed faintly in the candlelight, jagged fragments catching their reflections. The guests shifted uneasily, their faces multiplied in broken pieces. Poirot raised a hand. "You see yourselves, but in fragments, just as we have seen this affair in fragments. Now we shall piece them together." He turned toward Delphine. "Mademoiselle Vale, you spoke of a shadow, yet did not name it. Why? Because you feared to accuse one who might retaliate. But your omission told me you saw more than you admitted." Delphine's cigarette trembled. I could not be sure." Poirot bowed slightly. "Precisely. Yet you saw a man, not a shadow. Your silence was caution, not confusion." He faced the colonel. "Monsieur Armitage, you concealed your visit to the conservatory. Why? Because you feared it would appear sinister. But your truth was only the wish to smoke. Your lie was one of pride, not guilt." Armitage stiffened, but his shoulders eased a little as Poirot passed him by. He looked next at Julian. "Monsieur Hart, you observed the light in the gallery was dim. That tells us you were indeed nearby when events unfolded. You polished your glasses not from vanity, but from nerves. Yet your fear is not of guilt, but of being wrongly accused." Julian exhaled shakily. Relief mingled with lingering doubt. Poirot's eyes found Alice. "Mademoiselle Hart, you saw a woman carrying a letter. You believed it to be folded. You were correct, but you mistook haste for gender. The figure you glimpsed was not a woman, but a man, slight in build, whose silhouette deceived you. Yet even your mistake is valuable. It tells us the guilty one carried the torn letter fragment before Miss Daventry seized it." Alice looked stricken, her lips parted as though to protest, then closed again in silence. Poirot turned with deliberate slowness to Rupert Wayland. "Monsieur Wayland, your cufflink lay in the billiard room, and your wit has been your shield. Yet wit does not conceal the trembling of your hands. You mocked, you sneered, you flaunted disdain, but these are the gestures of a man cornered. Miss Daventry threatened to expose you, your debts, your false pledges to charity, your habit of using influence to mask dishonor. She confronted you here, before the mirror, and you feared the truth would be known. So you struck. The mirror shattered, and in the confusion you sought to silence her hand as well as her voice, but she wrote still with her blood and left you undone." Rupert laughed harshly, though no mirth reached his eyes. "What proof have you, Poirot? Words, scraps, shadows, nothing that would hang a dog." Poirot raised a finger. "But I have the order, monsieur. The torn letter came from Lord Radley's study. Who tore it? Not Lord Radley, who had no reason. It was you. You sought paper in haste when Miss Daventry resisted you. Your cufflink fell when you bent to retrieve it. Your matchstick betrayed you in the conservatory. Your hand frayed the cord of the telephone. Each trifle is nothing alone. Together they sing." The inspector stepped forward. "Is that enough for the law?" Poirot inclined his head. "The law, monsieur, may require more. But the truth requires only clarity. Ask him where he was at the moment of the cry, and watch how he falters." All eyes turned to Rupert. For once, his tongue failed him. He opened his mouth, closed it, laughed without sound, then sneered. "This is theatre, nothing more. You've no witness." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But we have a witness, the mirror. It holds the fragments of glass, each reflecting the moment of violence, and one shard, kept by me, bears the faintest smear of polish from your patent leather shoe. You were here, monsieur, when the mirror broke." Rupert's bravado collapsed. His face blanched, his hands clenched, and he stepped back as though the mirror itself accused him. She would have ruined me," he muttered hoarsely. "What else was I to do?" The inspector seized his arm, but Poirot raised a hand. "Let him speak. Confession is the final piece." Rupert's voice cracked. "She said she'd write to the papers, to expose me, to strip me of every patronage. I could not allow it. She stood there, righteous, and I lost my temper. I only meant to frighten her, but she slipped, struck the glass, Poirot's voice cut in, calm but firm. "Non. You pushed, you silenced, and she, with courage greater than your fear, wrote enough to condemn you." The inspector snapped the cuffs on Rupert's wrists. "That's all I need." The room exhaled as one, the guests shrinking from Rupert as though his guilt were contagious. Lady Radley pressed a handkerchief to her lips. The vicar bowed his head, tears shining. Poirot replaced the dust sheet over the mirror, his gesture tender, almost reverent. "It is finished. Justice will follow its course. But remember, mes amis, truth is a fragile thing. One breaks it as easily as glass. Yet even broken, it reflects." He turned to leave the gallery, his step precise, his shoulders squared, and his mustache immaculate, as though nothing in the world could disturb the perfect order of Hercule Poirot. The house seemed strangely hollow after Rupert Wayland was led away under the inspector's watch. The echo of the handcuffs still clung to the gallery like a lingering chill. Guests drifted back toward the drawing room in a daze, whispering softly as though afraid to disturb the hush that followed confession. Outside, the storm had given way to a calm sky streaked with pale gold, the sea no longer furious but heavy with silence. Poirot, however, remained in the gallery for a moment longer, standing before the shrouded mirror as though communing with it. He adjusted the dust sheet with delicate precision, smoothing the folds. His voice, when he spoke, was low but carried to Lady Radley, who had lingered nearby. "It is fitting, madame, that the mirror is covered once more. We have seen enough broken reflections. What matters now is not the fracture, but the truth it revealed." She placed a hand against her breast. "I cannot forgive myself for inviting them here, for placing Celia in danger." Poirot shook his head gently. "Non, madame. The danger was not of your making. It was in Rupert Wayland himself, his vanity, his fear of exposure. You merely provided the stage upon which his deception collapsed. Mademoiselle Daventry chose her battleground with courage. It was he who brought violence." The vicar entered then, moving heavily, his grief etched in every line of his face. He stood beside Poirot, looking at the shrouded glass. She believed truth must be spoken aloud. She gave her life for it. I only wish I had been there. Poirot rested a hand lightly on his arm. "Courage, monsieur. Your sister died with her purpose intact. Even in death, she spoke. The words she wrote, he knows. They condemned her killer. Few can claim such strength. Remember her not as a victim, but as one who stood unflinching before deceit." The vicar bowed his head, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. Later in the drawing room, the company gathered once more, subdued. Delphine sat quietly, her usual flamboyance dimmed. Greta stared into her teacup as though reading omens in the leaves. Julian was uncharacteristically silent, his spectacles folded in his lap. Colonel Armitage stood near the fire, rigid but thoughtful. Alice lingered close to Lady Radley, her expression earnest, as if trying to absorb strength from the older woman's composure. Poirot took his place by the mantel, the light of the fire flickering across his face. He regarded them all, his tone gentle yet commanding. "Mesdames, messieurs, you have witnessed tragedy, and you have seen justice begin its course. But permit me one final word. You ask why a man kills. It is rarely for passion alone. More often, it is fear. Fear of discovery, fear of shame, fear of losing the mask he wears. Rupert Wayland feared exposure more than he valued honor, and so he struck down one who threatened to strip his disguise." He paused, letting his gaze rest briefly on each of them. "But masks, mes amis, always crack. Lies are brittle. Only truth endures. Remember this, for it is not the first time such a lesson has been written in blood, nor will it be the last." No one spoke. The only sound was the steady ticking of the ormolu clock. At last, Lady Radley said softly, "You are right, Monsieur Poirot, and though I shall never forget this day, I shall try to remember it as Celia's triumph, not Rupert's crime." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "That is wisdom, madame." The inspector returned briefly to confirm arrangements. Wayland would be taken to Penzance at dawn. The house would resume a semblance of order. One by one, the guests retired, leaving Poirot alone by the fire. He sipped a final cup of tea, perfectly measured, perfectly stirred. His moustache gleamed in the firelight as he murmured to himself, "Order has been restored, the symmetry complete. The little grey cells are content." He set down the cup, rose, and with immaculate composure prepared to depart Windermere House. As he stepped into the corridor, his voice drifted back like a benediction. In life, as in mirrors, one must be careful what is reflected, for sooner or later it will look back at you.